Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here on Mint Press. Week in, week out, we are going against the grain and covering stories which are regularly marginalized outside the earshot and the eyesight of the masses. For that reason, we hope that you can support us by liking, sharing, subscribing on this video, but also supporting us on Patreon or with the recent fundraiser drive that we have. In order for us to continue independent media, we do need your support. And we appreciate the near 200 people who have supported us so far on our fundraising drive. Thank you to every single one of you. Now, this week, we have a very, very special guest, someone who I have been fortunate enough to share a platform with several times. And this episode will pertain to someone who I would say is the political prisoner of our time. At the time when the United States took the decision to go to war in Iraq, this is something tens of millions of people across the world in many different demonstrations protested against. This was something that even a government like the government in France stood against and did not want to go along with. What we saw was a decision taken largely against the will of the populations that these political elites ruled, and a decision which many in the Middle East and wider had a deep, deep aversion to. So at the very time when bombs were raining on a 4,000-year-old civilization in Iraq, when some of the most important historical sites were being desecrated by the most advanced military which has ever existed in the history of humanity, somebody took all of this anti-war feeling that he had from his background, from his already existing passions and activism, and found a way to directly work with those within the US military to make known what Donald Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns, to make us aware of the way in which our taxes were being spent and essentially policies that we deeply disagree with were being pursued around the world. Some of the most deeply heinous and hideous aspects of the Iraqi and Afghan occupations by the US, Britain, and allies have been revealed within the WikiLeaks files. We're talking about millions of documents were made available to the public to understand truly what was happening. And what do we see today? We see the person that took that leap of faith and knew they were risking their life. We see him now in a situation where he is certainly one of the most demonized human beings of our time. He has been stripped of all humanity and rendered among the unpeople. In a way, his willingness to take up and defend those who had been dehumanized on an industrial scale, he became one of them. When he was revealing Reuters workers and journalists on the streets of Baghdad being shot at by Apache helicopters and the recording of the reaction of the US military personnel to what they had done, he became one of those people through his loyalty to them. And today we sit in a situation where the people that took these deeply unpopular decisions and policies have gone on to make tens of millions of pounds, at least, just off the mere fact that they were there at the time. Tony Blair is undisturbed by his legacy. You do not see him being confronted regularly, and you certainly do not see him being stripped of his humanity in the way that Julian Assange has been. Quite the opposite. You see Tony Blair treated as an oracle, as somebody who is one of the adults in the room, as someone who possesses great wisdom about how politics should be carried out. And what about George Bush? You see him delicately humanized as someone passionate about painting. You see all the intricacies of his humanity when he's presented by popular US talk show hosts who fall over themselves to ingratiate themselves with this warmonger of a person. And so that really leads us to our guest today, who has also experienced this, entirely extraordinary situation from a very specific angle, from an angle that would allow her to appreciate elements of this story that many of us in the general public do not have the opportunity to. She's somebody who is struggling relentlessly, who's been part of building, a key part of building this fantastic movement, this historic movement to free Julian Assange. He's currently been in Belmarsh for several years. And from some perspectives, it seems maybe on the brink of extradition to the United States, where the US has made clear that it hopes to give him 175 years under the Espionage Act. And the use of the Espionage Act against a journalist in this manner is something that would be great to get into with legal expert Stella Assange and also the wife of Julian. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stella.
Thanks for having me.
Well, to start with, I'd just like to ask, how are you in the midst of this machine with lots of moving parts? There is a human story of people trying to raise a family. How are you doing? How are you feeling through all of this?
Well, I'd say it's a daily struggle. It's up and down. It's being pulled in different extremes. So the prison life is part of our daily life because Julian is there all the time. And he's been there for the past 4 years and 3 months. And all our interactions are within that prison context. They're either phone calls from the prison, which are interrupted every 10 minutes, and then he can't call back, and I can't call him. Our phone calls are only certain times of day. They're limited by budget. He can't spend unlimited funds on his telephone calls, even if he could, even if he had the money. It's limited by the prison how much we can talk. And then, so there's the daily struggle. We see each other once or twice a week for an hour and a bit at a time. And then there's the other perspective, which is the kind of drawn out fight and just the thought that we have been apart and Julian's been in prison in a single cell in the same space for over 4 years is pretty difficult to really understand. So I was in my mid-30s when Julian went to prison, and now I'm 40. When I met Julian, he was 39, and now he's 52. So, and he hasn't been... I met him, when I first met him, he was already under house arrest. His freedom had been restricted. And you just think, okay, even if we get through this, even if we are able to be together, which I do think is, we should win this. We can win this, and we should win this. We'll still have been robbed of our lives together. Our children will have been robbed of their early childhood with their father. We're never going to get that back. And Julian's health in the meantime has deteriorated because this is what a prison does to you. You lock a person in a cage for days and months and years and deny them sunlight, exercise, a healthy lifestyle, healthy food. And then that shortens their lives. It's just undeniable. And this has been done as an act of cruelty. So the enormous injustice of it, sometimes you stop and think, how is this even possible? But on the other hand, there are also huge shows of support. I think finally, even in the UK, a lot of people who were previously maybe not interested or moved by Julian's situation are starting to wake up to it.
On that subject, who would you say has surprised you in terms of those that have stepped forward and expressed support for Julian over this period?
I think it's opened my eyes to a lot of, I think political orientation is no predictor to finding people with compassion. Yeah. I've found that there's a lot of compassion and care from people who have nothing to do with Julian, but who just recognized injustice. They have a natural sense of justice. And then there are some people who are perhaps more psychopathic, who describe themselves to be perhaps more. I mean, this is no generalization, but I'm just saying that people who align themselves with a politics that is supposed to be about care and compassion and actually behave in quite a callous manner. I think it's certainly opened my mind and disposition to just not try to have any prejudice towards people who, I've been very pleasantly surprised and connected with people I never expected to connect with. And at the same time, you have some actors like some of the previous media partners, people who have known Julian, who at the time when it was cool said would,
and financially benefited as institutions from.
Yes, and financially benefited and won prizes and so on. And, talked about how important WikiLeaks is and to exposing war crimes and defending victims. And then when it comes down to it, they just have been silent when Julian's been imprisoned, and they've stopped talking about WikiLeaks' importance. Maybe because it at some point became costly for them in terms of their social capital. I don't think that's the case anymore. But I think we lost some people along the way where Julian was betrayed, and at the time it came to no cost to them. It actually came as a benefit to them. But to flip now and show support for Julian would expose how they betrayed him. Yeah. So I think there's some of that. But on the other hand, I think, I don't really care so much about what's in the past. I think it's much more powerful for everyone to be able to come together and say, Julian needs to be freed. And that includes Julian's, strong support base that has been there throughout. I think it's important for them to also invite people to come on board. And when Julian's free, then we can revisit some of the past, but now is not the time.
So where do we stand with the case today?
Well, Julian's situation is critical. I mean, we're now in the end game, as I've said before. What's happened is that the High Court has refused Julian permission to appeal. And this is quite incredible when you consider that what the High Court has affirmed is a decision from January 2021, in which, for example, several new crucial developments had not even happened at that point. So the most important one was that there was a very extensive investigation by 3 national security reporters based in DC. These are 3, DC insiders who have never expressed any kind of sympathy towards WikiLeaks, and in fact are in a probably quite a adversarial position, but who produced this incredibly in-depth, serious investigation, which revealed that during the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, who we knew was obsessed with WikiLeaks, I mean, he had given press conferences about it, but he had discussed assassinating Julian in the White House at the highest levels, and that Mike Pompeo had ordered his underlings in the CIA, when he was CIA chief, to produce so-called sketches and options about how to kidnap, rendition, or kill Julian. And this has never been denied. The CIA never denied it after the story came out. In fact, Mike Pompeo confirmed it by calling for the sources to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, not for libel, but for espionage, for disclosing true information that was classified. That was national defense information, i.e., true information. And the Spanish court has summoned Pompeo to respond to these reports. And these reports, you don't publish something like that lightly. So they had over 30, that's 30, over 30 sources, both named and unnamed, in the Trump administration, National Security Council, and CIA, very senior people confirming these reports. So it's not, there's been no refutation. So naturally, with this information, the natural thing, the fair thing, the independent thing to do would be to throw out the entire extradition. You can't possibly send Julian to the country that has plotted his assassination. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. And yet, the High Court, a single judge in the High Court, has just thrown it all out. This is just one of the arguments, but it's a very compelling one and an obvious one, right? So this judge just threw out the application for permission to appeal in a 3-page judgment and said nothing. There's no arguable point here. I mean, that's not a logical thing to do. So Julian has one final move here in the UK, and that is to go to separate panel of 2 judges who will review the original judge's decision and hopefully come to a different conclusion. But I think it's quite extraordinary that the High Court doesn't even want to hear Julian's arguments when this is the most important case for press freedom globally. And it's not just us who are saying it, as his family or his legal defense. It is every major human rights and press freedom organization. They're all saying the same thing. The New York Times, published an editorial saying this case goes to the heart of the First Amendment. The Washington Post said the same. The Guardian, even the Telegraph and the Daily Mail have said that this case has a major impact on press freedom globally, on journalists' ability to do their work, on setting a new standard in which you can just put journalists in prison for publishing the truth.
So can you tell us a bit about this potential use of the Espionage Act to prosecute a journalist? Why is that dangerous to everyone else as well?
Well, there are different aspects to this, but So Julian has been prosecuted under the U.S. Espionage Act, and this is a piece of legislation that's from 1917. So during the First World War, it was enacted to be able to prosecute people who were publishing pamphlets against the U.S. participation in World War I. And for 100 years, it was not used against anyone, or actually, it was used a couple of times, but conservatively, against journalistic sources. I think it was used on 2 or 3 occasions, and in one case, the person was pardoned. It just wasn't a tool to be used against whistleblowers, and that changed under Obama. And under Obama, the Obama administration prosecuted 3 times as many journalistic sources as all the previous administrations combined since 1917. So the Obama administration is the real turning point in which it starts being used against whistleblowers, against journalistic sources. Then the Trump administration came in and then took it even further and said, well, we're going to use the Espionage Act against the journalist as well. And they could do that because this piece of legislation is really broadly worded. It's vague. It doesn't forbid the publication of classified information per se, because the classification system in the US didn't exist until the 50s. It said national defense information. It doesn't define what that is. It's just basically what the US government says it is. And so if you use a piece of legislation and change the purpose of it to fit something else, like journalism, then you get a really distorted situation. So in Julian's case, you see this often described. He's being charged for espionage. No, he's not charged for espionage because the U.S. government is not alleging that he passed information to a foreign government or anything like that. That's not their case. Their case is that Julian received information from Chelsea Manning, who was this intelligence analyst in the U.S. military based in Iraq, and who had access to this information and was shaken to the core of her being when she was reading all these reports about what was going on and evidence of war crimes, for example, in the collateral murder video, which she described. And she then decided to give that to the press, and initially tried to the New York Times, the Washington Post. They didn't want it. And then she sent it to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks published it. And so that's what the U.S. accuses Julian of receiving, possessing, and communicating this treasure trove of information which laid bare the reality of those wars, of the torture regime, of the way the U.S. government, through its embassies, strong-armed European investigators into not prosecuting, extraditing U.S. personnel who had engaged in torture and so on. So it's really an attack on the ability to expose wrongdoing, and not just wrongdoing by your own government, but wrongdoing by a foreign government, and a foreign government which is the most, or at least has been for decades, the most powerful country on earth that has conducted, coups and invasions and violated international conventions and against torture, and committed war crimes and so on. If you, as a journalist from whatever country, but especially if you're not from that country, are gagged and imprisoned for exposing their criminality. It all becomes a big farce. That's what it is. It's a farce. And through this case, they're basically dismantling the entire system that was built after World War II. For journalists, it also normalizes the imprisonment of journalists because Julian is so high profile. I mean, someone who has no profile has no chance. Julian, I mean, he was monstered for many years, but he has a lot of allies, and he has a lot of allies who are world leaders. I mean, the Pope received me 10 days ago. I had a private visit with the Pope.
And it is worth mentioning that some of WikiLeaks' work did reveal some stuff that the Vatican wouldn't have been best pleased about coming out at the time. So it's quite interesting that would have happened.
Yes, I think I commend the Vatican for seeing the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
It's, you can't say the same for obvious other countries. So Julian has the allies. I mean, one couldn't hope for better allies. Not just talking about the Pope, obviously, but but all the press freedom groups and the human rights groups. Maybe they could have reacted sooner, for sure. Mm-hmm. But they're all on side now.
Yeah.
And so the fact that Julian remains imprisoned, despite all of that support, is really disturbing. It's a disturbing X-ray of the relative power distribution in 2023.
An interesting part of it is that Manning was, of course, I mean, as far as I understand, pardoned. So it's interesting that the source, has been pardoned, but the publisher is still going through this process. You also mentioned earlier about the sort of validity of even if you accept the tortured logic of what's going on, that obviously we know it's a show trial which is proposed in the US, but even if you accept that some type of legal process is going to take place, it's not only what you mentioned that should get it thrown out of court. Could you tell us a bit about UC Global, what happened in the Ecuadorian embassy, and why else that would render any sort of supposed trial completely invalid?
When we were in the embassy, Julian was in the embassy between 2012 and 2019 when he was arrested and taken to Belmarsh. And during that time, we knew that there was a lot of very disturbing things going on, but we didn't know exactly what they were. The security company that was working there, UC Global, was collecting information from us. Some of it was overt, but some of it we found out only after Julian's arrest. And in fact, we had some information about how sinister things were getting while we were still inside the embassy. So in December 2017, someone who worked for the security company followed me out to Sainsbury's. I went to get lunch, and then he popped up there and he said, "I need to talk to you. The baby that you come in with, you shouldn't bring him in anymore because we're being asked to do some very strange things."
And this was someone that you recognized from within the embassy, or was it a person you'd never seen before?
It was a person who had been in the embassy for, I had seen him pretty regularly by that point. And he said, well, for one thing is that they've asked me to to steal the nappy of this baby that you're bringing in, and they've told us that they need it because they want to analyze the DNA. Of course, at this point, our relationship was not public knowledge. We had taken great care to try to keep it private, even within this extremely surveilled, spied on space of the Ecuadorian embassy. And our eldest, Gabriel, he was 6 months old at this point. And so we had to, well, I wasn't able to bring him in after that point. I think I actually did it once more through someone else after a few months. But that was basically the last time Julian could regularly see Gabriel. And then we found out much more afterwards. After Julian's arrest, there were some of the workers for UC Global who then became whistleblowers, went to El País, and then went to Spanish police and gave them information about what they had been up to. And the Spanish legislation allows for charging Spaniards who have violated the law abroad to be prosecuted, and this is what's underway in Spain. So the director of the UC Global is under investigation for having spied on Julian's legal meetings, because what transpired through these whistleblowers, who also possessed some of the material that had been collected during that time. So they had hard drives with recordings of meetings with Julian's lawyers, legally privileged meetings where he's discussing his legal defense in case of extradition, in case of a case in the United States, and so on. Those recordings were taken to the United States every 2 weeks, and we have so much detail now about what was going on inside the embassy, because some of the people who were actually doing it then blew the whistle. And in the last few weeks, we've learned that the hard drives that were seized from Morales, from this UC Global CEO or whatever, his hard drives had actually been hadn't properly been copied by Spanish police, and some files from those hard drives had been withheld, had not been given to the court, to the investigators, to the prosecutor. So this is we're still trying to find out how this could have possibly happened. But what's clear is that the original drives contained directories that said embassy, it said United States /CIA /embassy Julian Assange. So it's that was what had been hidden, concealed. So the full picture becomes clearer and clearer. And the full picture is a extraordinary criminality on the part of the United States, not on Julian's side. I mean, Julian was just doing he was trying to live, and he has done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have this is kind of a pattern, right? The CIA committing crimes, plotting to kidnap, plotting to assassinate, violating attorney-client privilege, trying to get genetic material from a baby. I mean, it's just
lawless.
Yeah, lawless.
Mm. And I'm also interested in what kind of role was envisioned for the British in the plan to potentially assassinate Julian on British soil. Do you remember that?
Well, this investigation went into it a bit, but it hasn't been properly fleshed out. And this is something that I really think the British press should have jumped on and asked for answers about. So the article, which is, I think, 7,000 words, says that the US was speaking to UK counterparts. It doesn't say explicitly that they were speaking to them about assassination, but about potentially kidnapping Julian or apprehending him somehow, or maybe if he left the embassy. And what's clear is that the US had people on the ground because, of course, as you know from Ansekulas, there are CI operatives among us.
Well,
I mean,
12,000.
hopefully not too close, but
Yeah.
but they're operating on UK soil, and so there was according to this article, the British side said we'll do the shooting because what they had planned out was possible scenarios of ramming a car that Julian was in, even if it was a diplomatic car, right, with diplomatic immunity, ramming it, or shooting off the tires of a plane if he left in a plane, and completely insane stuff, you know. And it seems there that at that point the British authorities said, no, we'll do the shooting, we'll do the. I'd really like to know more.
So, I mean, it's important to mention that after this amazing revelation came out through Yahoo, you have within it the implication that the British would aid the US in a kidnap plan of Julian Assange, in which the British were allocated the job of doing the shooting, right? Quite what doing the shooting means, we don't know the full details, but we have some idea. Of all the branches of the BBC, this revelation was only reported by BBC Somalia. Just so we understand how uniform this is, we're talking from BBC English, BBC Arabic, BBC Persian. Not one of them covered it apart from BBC Somalia. So this was the sort of level of cover-up, we could say, of the Yahoo story. It is fascinating to see that process whereby when the mechanisms of demonization were fixed so solidly on Julian, some of the people who benefited most from his work and his risking of his life became part of the mechanisms of demonization. But then, as you know, a large part due to the work that you and many others have done, clarity has been achieved, we can say. But when that clarity has been achieved, some of those that along that trajectory have both benefited and actively demonized him are basically missing in action. But it's interesting also that you say that you're focused on the future and you feel this is a battle that we can win. Can you explain why you feel that way? Because in a way, one way we can read the story is a kind of story of invincible power. Another way we can read this story is continuous cracks within the wall of a monolith. So whether it is the contradictions that create something like WikiLeaks in the first place, the lack of consensus within the US military infrastructure that then leads to whistleblowers coming out and showing this stuff. And then, of course, what happened with UC Global. There's not a consensus, obviously, within this company that this is the right thing to do. So things start coming out. And then, obviously, the Yahoo investigation. There was, at very high levels of US power, there are people seriously unhappy with this, we could at least say, if we're looking at those sources for the Yahoo investigation. So is that something that potentially contributes to this hopeful outlook that you still have?
Absolutely. I think, and because I'm following it very closely, I see this, how controversial this case is, even internally in the United States, throughout each of the administrations, including the Trump administration. It's true that the kind of extremist zealots, i.e. Pompeo, got the upper hand. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't resistance within. I mean, over 30 sources were willing to speak to Yahoo.
I mean, that's a deeply unpopular policy then. If you can say there's 30 people within an institution like that willing to speak to media like that, it's unpopular what they're doing, even within it.
Yes, and in fact, these sources even said this was the most controversial thing within the intelligence community during the Trump administration. So, and the reason for that is that it is an outright criminalization of journalistic activity, of journalistic work. The way I see it is we have to win this. We have to win this because it's not like, look, it's already a departure. In order to free Julian, all that needs to happen is for the norms that have long existed to actually be enforced rather than be actively violated. Because by keeping Julian in prison, you have to violate all sorts of rules that have been there for a long time, including basic rules of freedom of expression and freedom of the press that exist in an open, truly democratic society. And what's happened is partly that there's been a willingness over time to violate those protections. There's also been a multi-pronged attack on WikiLeaks, financial, reputational, etc. And then at the same time, there's been a bigger trend towards censorship and ever greater abuse of power by the state. And partly because the state has grown more powerful and the state has become more diffuse. So the surveillance powers of the state, big tech's integration with those surveillance and censorship powers, the way it's all become very unaccountable, the way that the Five Eyes basically are also integrating at a completely unaccountable level that rests above democratic oversight. And just the way, for example, that the U.S. is applying its espionage laws extraterritorially to a foreigner in the UK.
Yeah.
So all these things are a complete breakdown and departure from what has long existed. And the only way to start grabbing back is to try to get things to back how they were 10, 12, 13 years ago, which was when WikiLeaks published and when maybe I think democratic transparency, accountability, etc. was at its strongest. And there's been a backlash, and we're fighting against that backlash generally. And if we fail, then it's just if Julian's case capable of reversing this trend, then nothing is capable of doing that, because it's just such a clear case where Julian was publishing evidence of crimes, the gravest possible crimes being committed against tens of thousands of civilians, war crimes. You have it in black and white, you have it in moving images, you have the numbers, you have the places, you have it in high definition.
Absolutely.
And so if exposing the gravest crimes is not protected, then it's all just a farce.
Yeah, absolutely. Stella, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I just wanted to ask you to let the audience know what exactly they can do to stand with Julian and support him, and the next actions that may be coming up to support him.
Right. So I have a free Assange emergency toolkit, which will be updated as on an ongoing basis, and I'll share the URL with you. There's also a few books people can read. Niels Meltzer, the Trial of Julian Assange. He was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. It's a very good book. Also, Stefania Marizzi, WikiLeaks and Its Enemies. These are great books. ITVX has the documentary following Julian's father and me as we fight for Julian's freedom. It's called Ithaca with a K, ITHAKA. And follow me on social media, Stella_Assange. And I'm very active on social media. I've opened DMs. Don'tExtraditeAssange.com has a newsletter. Just be engaged and come to the protest. It's really important to not just be engaged online, but to actually show your support in person, because I can't tell you what an important effect that has for Julian, for us, for the cameras, to show that Julian has support that is solid and persistent and has more resolve than his persecutors.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stella. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks.